Hey guys, welcome to 7 drum editing tips in 7 days. And today we're going to talk about how to get a great sounding snare in your DAW. So I'll be using Logic specifically for this. Some of this stuff can be applied for multiple DAWs, but if you are in Logic, you will find this the most relevant. So if you haven't been watching the previous episodes in this little mini series, no worries, because this is the episode where everything all comes together. We kind of bring together everything that I've kind of touched on. Well, not quite everything, but a lot of the principles that I've talked about come together in this. So don't feel like you're missing out if you haven't watched the previous episodes. If you have, then I'd still recommend watching this because it gives you good context on how to bring everything together and actually apply it in a working principle. So just before we dive into this, it goes without saying that you do need to concentrate on getting your snare to sound as good as you possibly can right at the source. And that includes making sure that it's tuned to whatever it needs to be tuned to, or at least that it's in tune with itself at each of the pegs. Make sure that the heads are fairly fresh and they're not old and battered. Same as you would when recording a guitar, you'd replace the strings before recording them. You know, you just want to put yourself in the best possible position to get a great sounding snare, and it's pointless just patching up errors that you've made. If you start off with a great sounding snare, it's going to be very easy for you at this stage, to continue to get a great sounding snare. It's going to be effortless for you. So here I'm going to focus on the snare top. So the first thing that I would do personally, give it a listen through, see what we're working with. So you can hear it's tuned fairly low. It's not the best, not the worst sounding snare in the world, but with a bit of treatment, we can get that to sound good in context of the whole mix. So the first thing that I'd do is apply a noise gate. The reason that I'd apply this first is it's going to be a lot easier for you to add compression and EQ once you've got rid of the bleed and the noises you don't want to hear. So personally, I think a snare is fairly easy to actually noise gate compared to things like toms, because there's often not too much bleed around it, and whereas toms I find interfere with each other a lot more. So I'm just going to play this through now, and I'm going to apply this noise gate to get rid of this microphone bleed and just talk about what I've done. So that is about as good as I think I'm going to get it. What I did was I used a threshold to determine at which point I could get the snare to be gated so it wasn't completely choking it, but so it wasn't also bringing too much of the kick bleed through that you could hear. Then I used the hold and release to add some of that sustain, include some of that ringing out of the snare without choking that too much. So once we've done that, then I would personally move on to compression. So you can see we've got quite a lot of compressors to choose from. I always do enjoy going for the Studio VCA. I think that sounds quite fat and big. So as I'm doing this, I'm going to be using the threshold to determine the level at which the compressor starts coming into effect. From there, I'm going to use the ratio to determine how much gain reduction there will be. For this, I'll probably use a very small amount because, as you can see by these waves here, there's not a lot of difference between each one. Then I'll use the makeup gain to match up the level of audio as to what it was before compressing, so we don't lose any of that level. After that, I'm going to use the attack to add some punch. So I'd probably be lifting this to about 20 to 30, 35 milliseconds to let through some of those transients and get a punchier sound. Then I'll be using this release just to tighten up the back end and make sure that the compressor doesn't compress longer than it needs to, essentially. So at that, I'm happy with that sound. I brought the attack to about 23 milliseconds there, as you can see, which has brought through a lot of them transients, and the snare sounds a lot punchier, as opposed to if I had it down at 0 milliseconds. So what I'd do from here is I'd bring up an EQ. So I'd go for the main channel EQ. So the first thing that I always like to do is add a high pass filter just to cut off some of those low frequencies and rumble that you can hear. So I'm just going to play this through now, and I'm going to just place this where I think sounds best. So around 120 hertz gets rid of some of that noise, some of that rumble, some of those unnecessary messy frequencies that we just don't need. So my usual process from here is I start off at lower frequencies and I work my way up across. So the first thing I like to do is, if I find it necessary, I'd like to add a little bit more body, a little bit more power around the 200, 240 hertz mark. So you can see here, there's already quite a lot there, so we're not going to add too much, but I'd like to add a bit more because personally I like that really overproduced sound. So from here, you can see there's a lot of frequencies around this 400-500 hertz mark, and it gives it that really wooden toy snare sound. And in this case, I really don't like that, and I don't want that in here. So I'm going to cut some of these frequencies out here around the 350 to 500 hertz mark. So I'm happy with that. It's got rid of some of those problem frequencies. It sounds a little bit less wooden now, in my opinion. So from here, I'll usually add some high frequencies, usually around the 2 to 2.5K mark, just to add a bit of snap. And sometimes I'd add a high shelf boost, just to add a bit of air. I'm just going to mess around with this now and see what sounds best, in my opinion. So I've added a bit of 2K there, about 3 dB. I was messing around with this for a short while. There's nothing up there really that would enhance the sound, so I've just decided to leave that. I am doing this on headphones, so I don't think I can hear this as good as I could usually do on my monitors. To be honest, this is a decent sound, I think, now. And we've got a bit more of that snap, a bit more punch. We've got rid of those problem frequencies, both around here and around the 400 hertz mark. So let's quickly A/B this and listen to the difference. So to me, I can instantly hear that it sounds much cleaner, especially due to getting rid of those problem frequencies. And it also sounds a bit brighter in my opinion as well, because it's very low tuned. It sounds quite dull, but that 2K boost, I think, gives it a little bit of brightness that it needs. So from here, I'd usually like to add some samples to reinforce the sound. I do have the Slate Trigger 2, which I would use, but I know not everybody has that, so I'm going to use the method that I talked about in a previous video on here. I think it was tip number 4, about how to create samples in Logic. So with this snare track highlighted, I'm going to go to track, replace our double drum track. So just for the sake of this video, I'm just going to make sure these are in line for this highlighted section. I'm not going to go through the whole song, but obviously in your case, you will go through the full song and make sure that they are matched up. So you can see here, it's not picked one up. So we're going to play around this threshold. There we go. Lower that threshold. Let's pick that up. Also, you need to be careful that when you're lowering this threshold to pick hits up that aren't quite as loud as others, that it's not picking up hits that aren't hits elsewhere. So choose the snare, SD1, press OK. And that's given us our sample track. So I'm just going to make sure that these are in line with the transients, just so we don't get a flammy effect. You can see that's slightly late. Slightly late. So I think there's a theme going on here. So I'm just going to drag this slightly back if I can. So we usually have to go to the start, just create a bit of space here. Get back to here, zoom in, drag this back slightly. Usually they'll all be out by the same amount. It's usually fairly consistent. Yeah, that looks a lot better. So now we'll choose what we want to use as a sample, go to drum kit and SoCal. So now I'm going to solo this snare track. And I'm going to solo this sample track, and I'm going to see what snare sample sounds best with it. So you could hear it was tuned a lot higher than the original snare. I've not got it perfect, but I just tuned it down just so the difference wasn't obvious and it merged in with the original snare much easier. So I can focus on blending that a bit later on with the context of the full song. But now I'm going to add some reverb to it. So what I'll do is create an auxiliary trap. So in reality, I'd probably have a reverb for the whole drum kit so it's consistent, but yet again for this video I'm just going to call it snare reverb. I like to go on Space Designer. I usually think that's the most versatile. It gives you the most control out of all the reverb plugins on Logic. I usually like to go for medium space, one of these two. I'm going to go for Hansa Studio. So first of all, I'm going to choose a bus as an input, bus 8, that's not used. Select bus 8 here. So let's get this reverb sound right, and then we'll make sure that the level is all right in context with the mix. So I'm happy with that now. So let's play these two snares together. We'll mute the snare bottom for now because we haven't touched that yet. And we'll make sure that the snare sounds good in context with this song. So I'm happy with that. I personally wanted a bit more snare reverb. I like to hear that even with the full mix. Some people prefer it more blended, so it's there, but they can't hear it's there. But I'm personally happy with that. So now I'm going to repeat this process with the snare bottom, but this is much easier because to keep this consistent, I'm going to have the same noise gate on it, the same amount of compression, but I'm going to do the channel EQ a little bit differently. So because the snare bottom is capturing the snare wires, we want to make the most of this high end and add a bit more of that crack, that snap into the snare sound that we don't really have yet. So I'm going to keep this here. I'm going to play around with the rest of this and see what comes out. So you can see there's not a lot of power in it at all, but it's basically just there for that, them snare wires, that sound, to add that to the actual snare top sound. So I've added more of the 2K, and I've also added that high shelf boost as well to get some more of that high end to make the snare sound brighter. So now I'm going to determine the level between these, the snare top, the sample, and the snare bottom, and get that perfect balance. I nearly forgot to add reverb to it then, so let's quickly add that. What's that one? It's 3.4. There we go. So you can just hear from me soloing it and muting it there, the difference that bottom mic position makes to the overall snare sound. So that is pretty much everything I would do. Now let's play this in context with a song and listen to the snare sound. So there we go. I'm happy with that sound. It sounds a lot better, a lot more professional and polished, a lot cleaner than it did before. So that is personally my process that I'd do throughout getting a good snare sound. A lot of people would spend more time editing it in context to the song, which makes sense, but this video in particular is about getting the good snare sound first and then putting it in context to the song after. So that's why I've done it the way I've done it. Everyone's different. It's important to know that mixing is a creative thing. There's not one way to do it, and this is my personal way. I hope I've shed some light onto some things for you. I hope I've maybe given you some more ideas or certain things to try out. If you have any comments about this, if you'd like to tell me a bit more about what you do, your process, or question some of my processes, then I'd be more than open for a discussion in the comments section below.